Is a wavy border important? And what is a wavy border? A wavy border is a border that you put around a quilt that you've spent lots of time on that actually has extra fullness in it that creates a wave effect when you look at the quilt. Why do you care about a wavy border? Well, a wavy border will drive your long arm quilter crazy as she or he tries to put that on their long arm machine and get that to line up and be stable. There'll be fullness when they try to sew those borders down. It matters. It matters if you were to quilt the quilt at home on your domestic machine or on a mid-arm yourself, where you're creating a sandwich of the back, the batting, and the top, and you're basting that either with pins or with basting stitches, and you're doing that on your machine, you're still going to have problems, because when you get to the point where you're trying to long arm those borders, you're going to have extra fullness and it's not going to want to lay flat, and it's going to give you problems. So what we're going through today is talking a little bit about how to put borders on in a way that they're not wavy or have extra fullness in them that will give you issues either in the quilting of the quilt top to the backing when you're done, or in the way it hangs on a wall when you hang it. So let's get started. So today we're going to talk about quilts and borders, because a lot of people attach their borders to their quilts in a lot of different ways, and the way that you attach it is going to impact how the quilt is going to be quilted when the top is complete. And it's also going to impact your ability to hang it on a wall where it looks square if you plan to put it on a wall, or even how it will look laying on a bed if you're going to put it on a bed. There are really some great ways to put borders on quilts, and then there are some ways that you can put borders on quilts that will potentially give you trouble as you go down the road once your quilt top is complete. When I started, the methods that I used for putting borders on didn't always give me the best results, and when I started long arming several years ago and putting my quilts on a long arm where you're attaching them and rolling them and creating a sandwich, it very quickly became apparent to me how important the border on a quilt can be. A couple of the quilts that I've done, such as the one I'm working on today, is actually a panel that I purchased, and I've got a couple of these panels here because I'm going to gift one of them. But this is a panel. I'm going to start with the panel, and then I want to add borders to this panel to get it to the size that I want it to be for a wall hanging. So it's going to have several borders on it to start with, so that means that several opportunities for the quilt to become wonky whenever I try to hang it on a wall, as well as several ways that it can get wonky when I'm trying to put it on the long arm to quilt it. So the best way to add borders to these quilts, and this is a really good example because it's kind of small and easy to work with, the best way when you're working on something like this is to, instead of what tends to happen is people tend to want to cut a really long strip, and then they want to start sewing at the top, sew till they get to the bottom and cut it off even. And what'll happen is, as you're sewing the two pieces of fabric, there is some give to this fabric, and there'll be a bit of give to the border that you're putting on, depending on how you cut it. And when you sew that on, if you haven't measured that carefully and done that correctly, the border will be wavy. And then when I get ready to do the next border on that border, then it'll progressively get to be it'll progressively get worse. So for what I'm doing on these, what I did to decide how my border was going to be, the first border is going to be something I cut 2.5 inches. So when I'm done, it'll be a 2-inch border, and then I'll move on and I'll do a couple of more borders. But the way that I measured how I wanted to do this was, I knew I wanted to put my borders on the sides of the quilt, and then once I get the borders on the side, I'll come back and add borders to the top to frame it in this first border fabric that I'm using. So the way that I started that was to lay out my panel and lay it out, and I measured from somewhere near the center of the panel, and I measured the length. So this panel is 41 3/4 inches long. So that told me that I need to cut 2 borders and they both need to be the same length. So even if I come out to the side and I were to measure this, and see, when I measure this, it's almost 42 inches at the side, and then when I measure this other side, this one is more closer to the 41 3/4. So it's slightly different. And when you make a quilt that you've pieced and you've been working on, you're going to have a situation where your quilt's not going to be perfectly square. So I knew this was about 1/4 inch, a little bit different. So I wanted to leave it that way so that you could see that. So when I measure down the middle and I get that initial measurement, that's the measurement I'm going to work with. So 41 3/4. So I cut 2.5 inch strips and I cut them to 41 3/4. Even though one side is 42 and one side is closer to 41 3/4, I will fold this in half to get my center. So, and I usually use a straight pin to pin that, and then I'll fold it in half again to get my 1/4 mark. And then I will do the same thing to the side of the quilt so that when I lay this side out, it's evenly proportioned along the side of this border. And I will pin that down, and then I will go to the sewing machine and sew that. So that'll be my start point. So I will know that when I'm done, 41 3/4 is the length of my quilt on both sides, and it's all nice and even. I measured the length of this panel, and then I cut my 2.5 inch strips, and then with those, I laid them on there. And first I found my center and I found my 1/4 marks on both the panel and on the border. And then I pinned that down and I stitched these on, and then I pressed them. That's how we get these first borders on. So now, and again, this can be a progressive problem. So you want to continue the same methodology in that you want to know that these borders are exactly the same size. And now I'm going to put a top one and a bottom one, and I want to know those 2 borders are exactly the same size. So now that I have these borders, and I usually wait to measure until I get the borders on, I will measure somewhere near the middle, and I know I can see that this is 27 inches, actually 26 7/8 inches. Okay, so when I cut my side borders, I'm going to cut both of them at 27 inches, and that way when I'm done, this will still be rectangular. It'll be the same width, it'll be the same length, and that way I know that when I start to add my next set of borders, I'm in good shape. And I'm going to continue to be not square, but rectangular in this case, so that my borders will not, I won't end up with borders that have pulled. Okay, so I'm going to sew this top and this bottom on, and then once that is done, I'm going to come back and I'm going to measure the length again. And then I'm going to cut this next border, because this is the fabric I intend to use on the next border. And this is a cut of fabric that I had in my stash. So this is fabric off the bolt that I purchased. So this is my salvage. This is the long end of this fabric, right? So your tendency is going to be to lay this on the cutting table and cut 2.5 strips across this particular piece of fabric to get your borders. But what happens is that the fabric in that direction has more give to it than it does in this direction. There's no stretch in the lengthwise parallel to the salvage. There's no stretch like there is going side to side. So if you want borders to stay even and you don't want them to be wavy and have any stretch to them, take your yardage and cut your border lengthwise, cut off the selvage, because the selvage doesn't have the same kind of texture to it, the rest of the fabric, but cut your selvage off and then cut your borders lengthwise, going parallel to the selvage. I'm going to cut a length of fabric pieces for each side of the quilt. And those 2 pieces will be sewn to the first border, and that will give me a second border. And I will continue to add borders until I get to a point that I have created the effect with this panel that I want, and I have it to the size that I want for a wall hanging, which is what I intend to do with this particular one.